Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Logos to discuss the Church Fathers. We're episode 17, beginning with quite a long series on Justin the Martyr. We'll be with Justin for a while, and he's one of the earliest Church Fathers from which we have an actual large amount of material to read that's actually accepted to be his. Now, there is some disputes over what can be included and what can't, but even though that which is included is quite substantial. So, as a sort of a recap, Justin the Martyr was born in 110 AD in Flavia Neapolis, a city in Samaria, modern-day Nablus. His father and grandfather were likely Roman. Before his conversion to Christianity, he was a student of Greek philosophy. He was inspired by the Christian fearlessness in the face of death. Once converted, he became a great evangelist for the faith. He likely settled in Rome and was plotted against by the philosophers of Rome, probably cynics. His testimony was sealed with martyrdom. Now, we also see that his works, we can divide them into three broad categories: undisputed, disputed, and spurious. His undisputed works include the two apologies, the dialogue with Trypho. The disputed works include an address to the Greeks, a oratory addressed to the Greeks, on the sole government of God, an epistle to Diognetus, fragments from a work of the resurrection, and other fragments. Spurious works included the exposition of the true faith, replies to the Orthodox, Christian questions to the Gentiles, Gentile questions to the Christians, epistle to Zenos and Serenus, a refutation of certain doctrines of Aristotle. And with regards to the two apologies, there's some minor dispute. So the basic position is the first apology was written during the reign of Antonius Pius and the second during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Some people think that the second apology is a preface to the first. Some people think that there are two apologies, but Eusebius was wrong in affirming the second was addressed to Marcus Aurelius. And the fourth position is that the two which is the same as the first, is that the Eusebius is correct in his reputation. Now, as to what I think about the first and second apologies, I can't really add anything to that. I don't really know the controversy that well, but those are some of the preliminaries of Justin the Martyr before we dive into his work here. The other thing here is we look at the first apology. Chapter 1 is just simple address, but it's important in who it's addressed to: the emperor, Antonius Pius, his son, Vermicius the philosopher, and to Lucius the philosopher, the natural son of Caesar and adopted son of Pius. So the audience is educated and more specifically philosophical, and I think we can deduce more specifically Platonic, because he'll make reference to Plato throughout much of these early chapters. In that case, I think that indicates the nature of his audience. So the basic premise here is he's dealing with false, in his mind, accusations against the Christians. And the first few chapters have a sort of almost like legal brief feel to them. So in chapter 2, we read that the true philosopher loves what is true, not what is merely tradition. Do not pass judgment on the Christians without having heard their own testimony, right? Because Christians are being accused of being new. They're new, so they're bad. And he's like, well, you're a philosopher. Philosophers don't really do this. He says, don't listen to the rumors and the slanders of those who hate the Christians. The Christians believe that no true evil can be done to them since they receive their glory of Christ. You can only kill us, not harm us. Yeah, that's really interesting how this shows us the Christian psychology. And I'll read that last sentence from chapter 2. For as for us, we reckon that no evil can be done us, unless we be convicted as evildoers or proved to be wicked men, and you can kill but not hurt us. And that's the words, paraphrasing of the words of Christ, where he says, fear not the one who can kill the body, but the one who can kill the soul in hell. Now, chapter 3, we see Justin demands that Christians be tried according to legal precedent. One must be proven to be guilty of a fault before one is condemned by law. If Christians are in fact blameless, then why do we persecute them? the Romans. Why do the Romans persecute them? If no conviction of the Christian is possible, then do not listen to the slanders of envious men. And then he quotes from the Republic, Book 5, Chapter 18, where we read, unless both rulers and ruled philosophize, it is impossible to make the states blessed. So this is his first direct appeal to philosophical Platonic tradition, which is why I think that if Pius isn't a Platonic philosopher, either his son or adopted son is, which is why he would make this connection to the audience. Justin believes it is his task to show the Romans what exactly the Christians believe, to inform them of the true and harmless nature of the faith. Justin appeals to the justice and goodness of Antonius Pius to hear him out. So at this point, is there anything you want to interject with, Logos?
So I have some notes from the first few chapters. First question I had was back in chapter 1, when he's making the address. He says that this is on behalf of all nations who are unjustly hated and abused, and he counts himself among them. What is the significance of referring to himself as a nation, or referring to individual persecuted persons as nations?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point here. So later on in this era of church history, the Christians are sort of referred to as the third nation, neither Jew nor pagan. So right, unlike the Jews, they don't, have animal sacrifices. They don't have a priesthood. They don't have burn incense. They don't have circumcision. But unlike the pagans, they don't do all sorts of other things that pagans are prone to do. So we can read this in probably at least one of two ways. One way is that the church, the Christian, is the third nation, and that there are representatives of the Christian faith in all the nations of the world, if only in this case it'd be the known world, the Roman world, and later on throughout the early centuries, Christians are making reference to converts from the barbarian kingdoms. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, I guess, would be that he does view Christians as a persecuted minority, analogous to, say, the Jews at the time and other nations subject to Rome. So I think those are two possible readings of that.
Yeah, I mean, those make sense. The only thing that bothered me was referring to individual people themselves as nations. He's not like he doesn't say like among a persecuted nation, or I'm a representative of a persecuted nation. He says, of all those nations who were hated and wantonly abused, myself being one of them. So I assumed that them was the nations.
Oh, well, but couldn't that also just be that he includes himself as one within the category of those nations?
It could be. It just struck me as like really strange.
Well, another thing too, though, in antiquity, though, a nation is often identified by a certain patrilineal founder. So the nation of Israel takes its name from Jacob, whose name is Israel. The Spartans consider themselves heirs to Hercules, and the Romans to Mars.
Mm-hmm.
So I think also you might refer to the nation as an individual in a sort of like shorthand, referring to the sort of patrilineal forebear.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's all I was trying to figure out. It just seems that the word was being used a bit strange, and I wanted to know the full significance. So in chapter 2, my only note here in chapter 2 was when he says, reason directs those who are truly pious and philosophical to honor and love only what is true, declining to follow traditional opinions if those be worthless. I mean, my comment would be, I love Christianity even if it weren't true. Even if I'm not a Christian, I don't think Christianity is true. I'd still love it anyway, because Christianity gave a lot to the world. It doesn't seem to do a whole lot of harm in my view. Does more good than harm, if nothing else. So I don't know that that's necessarily true, but I get what he's getting at in these chapters, right? He's just trying to say that you shouldn't screw with people under false pretenses is basically what he's trying to get at. But it just struck me as an interesting, because I do think this also comes from Plato. I remember reading in some of the dialogues with you and Andrew where Plato would say this kind of thing all the time, right? You should only love what is true. And I'm just like, I don't know. And this just struck me because this is where like my Platonist like leanings conflict with my pragmatist leanings, where I'm just like, I want to agree with Plato, but I'm also a pragmatist. So chapter 3, um, now here's where things get really, really interesting, right? If this is where he's more of a Plato follower, then this should be really, really apparent to him. I forget the name of the dialogue, but the quote is, um, and every sober-minded person will declare this to be the only fair and equitable adjustment, namely, that the subjects rendered an unexceptional account of their own life and doctrine, and that the ruler should give their decision obedience not to violence and tyranny, but to piety and philosophy. Now, on the one hand, I could see like where that comes from the Republic, but on the other hand, there's a question of who chooses what is just, who chooses what is tyrannical, right? And there's that dialogue that me, you, and Andrew read, where Plato tried to investigate like three different ways of determining what's just and what's tyrannical. There was the ruler, there was the people, and there was like the courts, and all of them had problems because if anything, the ruler deems can be just or unjust, then like how do you check the ruler? Um, so maybe it's the masses, but if the masses do it, well, the masses killed Socrates. He kind of foreshadowed himself there. So I mean, what determines what the masses ought to think? Well, is it courts and legal precedent? Well, if it's courts and legal precedent, well, then like moral change is impossible. Um, and so if he's appealing to this idea that you should abhor tyranny, love piety and philosophy, I think that philosophy is going to say like where's the boundary between those things, and this might be like a technical gotcha in one sense, but in another it's not. So if you look at like the grand scheme of what's going on here, he's being persecuted just for being a Christian, right? His namesake is what's getting him in trouble here, as he would say, not anything that he's done, right? Show me a law I've broken, show me somebody I've hurt, show me a victim. um and so this goes to a question that actually has plagued us since the modern day. I mean, when I was reading this, right, I couldn't stop thinking about McCarthyism and the communist basically crusade that was going on at the time. How many people were kind of roped into it just because maybe they called themselves communists, associated with communists. They didn't try to blow up any buildings. They didn't try to like kill anybody. They didn't try to like, whatever. They just thought, oh, more equitable economy, communism, whatever sounds like a good idea or something. And they're just kind of like roped into this like McCarthyist crusade. And so that was the backdrop to which I was reading this because I'm looking, from modern lens backwards. I kind of have no choice. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm torn because this is where like Hobbes comes in, right? Um, on the one hand, it does seem kind of like a jerk move to, rope people in and persecute them because they're following, the namesake of somebody you deem to be like a revolutionary, like outgroup in your country. Um, on the other hand, I think the really interesting philosophical question here that's being implicitly broached but not like answered in a lot of detail would be something like, how far do we allow that to go, right? So I think you and I might have had talks on McCarthy, and I think we had like a nuanced discussion in which there's some sense in which he went too far, and there's some sense in which like he was really onto something because some people were really plotting some really nasty stuff. Um, and so there's a sense in which you can't let splinter groups in your country um, get too far and destabilize things, even if the individuals haven't done anything wrong. Cracking down on the symbology the group represents might be important enough to the stability of the empire that you have to do it, even if people get caught in the crossfire. And on the other hand, it's like, I don't know, maybe you don't, because maybe if you make martyrs of people who haven't done anything wrong, you're just going to be in big trouble. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think to add to your point real quick here, there's a footnote which is explaining what Justin said, because he's not complaining that he's just being persecuted for a name. That's part of it. But it says, that is to say, if the Christians refused or neglected to make their real opinions and practices known, they would share the guilt of those whom they thus kept in darkness. So he's saying that that you have a misunderstanding of what the name means, right? So he's not like, it's not like a communist radical who's like, no, you totally get it right. We want to like overthrow the government, right? Justin's like, no, you got it totally wrong. We don't want to do that, and let me explain to you what we actually do. And I think
Right.
that's where it's different. But yeah, I mean, there are certain cases in which you have a regime, or sorry, a movement which, if tolerated even a little bit, would lead to the collapse of the regime itself. I mean, one could argue that the fact that the Bolsheviks were treated with kid gloves by the Tsar ended up, in 1905, ended up blowing up in his face, 12 years later. So I know, but that if you're too harsh, then you drive people into their arms anyhow. It's kind of a balancing act.
Yeah. And so from a question of like just and unjust, I think that this is where we have to zoom out and look at things in a broad perspective, right? Because I guess the issue here is trying to look at justice as some platonic ideal you're striving for, but we have to balance this with constraints, right? Like there are just ways we'd love to just let everybody get along and live their own lives, but there's also the stability of the country to care for, because if the country implodes, everybody suffers a whole bunch. And so it's like if you just look at a question in isolation, should you persecute people for following a namesake even if they've broken no other laws? It's well, that sounds terrible. But if you were to be okay, should you persecute people for a namesake who've broken no laws if it means allowing them to live or allowing them to spread and do whatever, means the destabilization of your country and the suffering of millions of people? It's okay, well, now that's a really interesting question. And I think that these dialogues, these arguments, they do a good job at showing one side of it, but I don't think it's until you get to Hobbes, Locke, and a bunch of other people later on. So I might be wrong. I mean, maybe Aquinas wrote some about this I haven't read, and so on. That you get to see the other side of it and ask the questions of how do countries stay together? And I think a big part of that, ironically enough, is because the fall of Rome was so massive that all the historians that are writing about politics have no choice but to look back at it hundreds of thousands of years later to say, okay, how do we not be like that? Because that was pretty terrible.
Well, I think we'll see some of what you're talking about when we get to Origen's dialogue with Celsus, where we do get to see a pagan critic of the Christians engage in a tit-for-tat dialogue with Origen.
Well, that sounds interesting.
So this is really just from the Christian side, but we'll see actually a give and take a bit later on in the series. All right, chapter 4. We have, a name is neither good nor evil unless one speaks to the actions associated with that name. Justin argues that if any Christian could be shown to be an evildoer, he agrees that such a one should be convicted. But he argues no proof has yet been given, being that the name is all that convicts. These convictions are based on a name and not on demonstrable fact. Justin engages in a wordplay, and this is something I wouldn't have picked up at Hadman for the notes, that both in Greek, Christian and excellent sound very similar. And so he's saying that you're persecuting the excellent ones. It's sort of a double entendre he's going for here. He argues Christians are being persecuted for being excellent. Christians are punished for merely having a name. Christians are like the philosophers of old, being persecuted by envious persons. Yeah, there's Socrates right there. Christians are accused of atheism, but poets who besmirch the honor of the gods are given praise. Well, that's clearly from the Republic, because that's what Plato says, why they're going to ban the poets. So we're already seeing in this chapter here, he's making reference to Socrates and Plato. Chapter 5, we have Christians are not atheists. This is a charge coming from Satan and his demons who deceive you. Your gods are demons. Yeah, probably not a good way to win the Romans over. Your gods are demons who deflower women and abuse boys. Christians, just like Socrates, seek to turn you away from these harmful spirits, and demons like Socrates are being persecuted unto death. The behavior of these demons, your gods, are not fit to be ascribed to men, let alone divine powers. Yeah, I mean, all of this can be found in the Republic, where he criticizes Homer, and in the Death Dialogues. Okay, chapter 6. The next one. Justin admits to being an atheist as far as denying the gods of the Roman pantheon, but not as regards the creator of the universe and his Son and his Holy Spirit. 8. A Christian cannot lie, therefore a Christian must confess Christ as Lord, even if that means his own death. The Christian believes that when he dies, he will be judged by God for his deeds and rewarded or punished accordingly. This is similar to what Plato says about Rhadamanthus and Minos, judging the dead and the true philosopher. The main difference being, according to Plato, the judgment lasts 1,000 years, whereas for the Christian it lasts for an eternity. If the Christian is mistaken in his belief, he harms no one, and it is at most only harming himself. So I think what you said earlier in the discussion, Logos, that Christianity doesn't seem to be harming anyone, that's actually a claim Justin makes right here. So any thoughts on those chapters?
Yeah, I had notes on chapters 4 and 5. So 4, I don't want to belabor the point because the note I've already talked about in another chapter, but I like the end of chapter 4 when he says, "And of these some taught atheism, and the poets who have flourished among you raise a laugh out of the uncleanness of Jupiter with his own children, and those who now adopt such instruction are not restrained by you, but on the contrary, You bestow prizes and honors upon those who euphoniously insult the gods. I've never seen that word before. Anyway, so yeah, I like this because with that little quip, he's pointing out that like if he's being prosecuted for some kind of impiety, they got nothing on him because he might say what he want about the Roman gods, but look what the poets say, and they're not charged. So I mean, that's just showing that like if impiety is a charge, then they got nothing. Now, if it's atheism that's the charge, that's the interesting question, right? Because that's where chapter 5 goes to. So in response to the why then should this be charged with atheism part at the beginning, my view is he answers that a little later, as you commented, right? So when I was reading this chapter, I couldn't help but think of it in terms of what's that guy you're always talking about? Baudrillard, I think, the simulacrum or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think what's going on here, and they just don't have the language to talk about it yet, is that there is a way you can critique the mythos of Rome from within the simulation, within the simulacrum, however you want to say that, right? There's a way you can critique it within on its own terms that they're okay with, right? Because it accepts some precepts, and you just go, man, we all agree with the story, right? Haha, look how much of a jerk Jupiter is, or whatever, right? But what he's doing is he's kind of like going outside the simulation, and he's trying to like critique it from without and trying to say, here are these ways of viewing your gods from outside the way you're supposed to view your gods that make them look like horrible demons, right? Like the fact that you like this stuff at all, the fact that you're in this thing at all is terrible. We have to smash the whole thing, basically. And I think that's really the answer to his question of why then should this be is exactly the question of simulation. There's within criticism that the poets do, and there's the without criticism that Christians do when they critique Rome from as being outsiders, basically. Is
So
I
wait,
think what's going to be.
are you saying that they're doing the same thing? That the poet and the Christian are both pointing out the absurdity of the gods, but from different points of view?
Yes.
You know, that's actually really interesting because I mean, obviously, that's not how Socrates and Plato took it. Or maybe it was, because you remember that part from the Republic where he explicitly throws shade on Homer, referring to the lying dream to Agamemnon.
So I think with the Republic, it's Greeks talking about Greeks. You got Plato, Socrates, and so on talking about the poets who are also Greeks, and they're all talking about the stories they're telling about gods together. In this case, I think what you have is you have the Roman poets critiquing the Roman gods, Jupiter and so on. And you have the non-Roman Christians calling the gods demons. Now, ultimately, if you parse all the words, they're making the same accusations, right? So let's say if the Roman tells a story about the gods violating like a woman, and they'd say, well, we'd never do that as citizens. We don't think that's a very good thing to do at all, right? But they have these stories they have to talk about. But there's like this pious within the system way of kind of finger wagging about the gods and why we shouldn't act that way. The Christians, being outsiders, are just like, well, we're not going to like tell the story through like your lens. We're just going to call them what they are. They're just demons. Deal with it, right? And so like they're making this outsider's criticism of the system itself, which sets them up to be kind of like enemies of the state.
Yeah, well, also to your point, that the Christian and the poets are kind of trying to say the same thing. Paul says this in Acts 17, verse 28. For in him we live, move, and have our being, as also some of your poets have said, for we are also his offspring. So you could argue that what Justin is doing is merely an extension of what Paul already created a space for in his own work in Athens.
I believe it.
And actually, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really good insight there. So on to 9. Idol worship is folly. Your gods are demons. How can divine things be represented in physical form? The God Christians worship is eternal and ineffable. His name is not attached to images, but to incorruptible things. These gods demand your daughters degrade themselves in ways no philosophical person would tolerate. You ascribe to gods what is unlawful for men to do. That last bit is going to be a common theme throughout Christian criticisms of paganism. Even Augustine in the City of God will echo some of these criticisms. But yeah, I think reading this directly is really important for a point that I'm going to make. And neither do we honor with any sacrifices and garlands of flowers such deities as men have formed and set in shrines and called gods, since we see that these are soulless and dead and have not the form of God. For we do not consider that God has such a form, as some say that they imitate to his honor. Well, I mean, that right there is an open and shut case that Justin the Martyr doesn't believe that Christians have images, because he says that God does not have a form. And then he says,
Right.
we have the names and forms of those wicked demons which have appeared. For why need we tell you already know what you already know, into what forms the craftsmen carving, cutting, casting, and hammering fashion these materials? And out of vessels of dishonor, by merely changing the form and making an image of the requisite shape, they make what they call a god, which we consider not only senseless, but to be even insulting to God, who, having ineffable glory and form, thus gets his names attached to things that are corruptible and require constant service. So I think here we have a principle or heuristic of theology, which makes it clear that Justin, and we'll see even far more clear statements as we move into the history of the church, that any sort of iconography is just not compatible with simple Christian, what's euphemistically called primitive Christian doctrine.
Yeah, I think I agree with that assessment as well. I mean, looking at this from a philosophical perspective, if I was going to take the position of a pagan at the time and play some sort of devil's advocate for them, I think what I would ask is something like this to Justin. I would say, well, okay, let's take the story of Christ at face value, right? Here's an interesting thought experiment. If Christ comes to Earth with the goal of, say, dying for our sins, um, what would have happened if the Romans had been smart enough to, instead of kill Christ, like, I don't know, um, lock him in a box and like force feed him or whatever until he like died of old age, and like just make sure he couldn't have done what he set out to do. Um, Now, when you're talking about like God the Father and like the general Godhead in Christian theology, yes, definitely without form. It's like when they ask in the Old Testament, it's like, what are you? It's like, well, I am what I am. Deal with it. It's like I'm a formless God. Um, but when it comes to Christianity specifically, now we get an interesting story where like God comes to earth in Christ to do something as Christ. And it's like, thank goodness that his story like, worked out right. But I guess mortals have free will, and God does value mortals having free will. So I think there is something interesting about that story in which like mortals really could have thwarted the plan in a similar way in which mortals could, like, I don't know, burn a temple down to like a pagan god or something. They're not exactly the same, of course, but I think there's a parallel worth investigating if I was there at the time.
Okay, so to be clear, it sounds like you're asking two questions. One question is, well, according to Christianity, doesn't God eventually have, or at least some aspect of God, have a physical manifestation, i.e., Christ, and then his incarnate body? And then two, because of that, uh, doesn't that leave Christianity open to some of the claims of absurdity of physicality, like we saw with temple guards?
Not quite, because that's talking about like the future. So I think answering that charge would be easy. Christ would be physical when he has full dominion, and when Christ has dominion, he'd have no need for temple guards because he's control of everything on earth. Um, no, it's more of like a counterfactual question about the past, right? Because Christ came in the past to fulfill a mission, to die on the cross, and so forth. And what I'm saying is, insofar as Christ was physical in the past, uh, he was susceptible to the thwarting of mortals in the sense that God gives mortals free will. And so if the Romans had been smart and like knew what God was scheming or whatnot, they could have like captured Christ and like, swooned him away to somewhere and forced him to live a life of like luxury until he died at the ripe old age of like 85 or something, and like thwarted his own martyrdom, let's say. It's more in that vein.
Right. I suppose, yeah, one could say, well, it's funny you bring that up, right? Because there was growing up, there was I was a fan of what is called alternative history, where you sort of speculate on at a pivot point in history, what if it had gone the other way? Usually that revolves around battles, but not always. Maybe somebody dies in an accident or an assassination attempt that didn't otherwise die. Um, and there was a series called What If, and then which was mostly battles, but then there was a What If 2, which included other non-battles, and one of them was what if Christ didn't get crucified? And this guy sort of goes into exactly the same kind of question that you're talking about now. I think what a Christian would then say to the pagan or to anyone today is that I mean, you kind of know where I stand on middle knowledge here, Logos. I'm going to make a middle knowledge appeal here.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think what's interesting is at the time, middle knowledge didn't come up until what, the Middle Ages, right? Because
Yeah, a little bit later, yeah.
yeah, and so I guess my point here is I'm not saying this charge wouldn't have an answer. I'm saying back at the time this would have been an interesting countercharge to make because it kind of would have like forced the discussion to go that way hundreds, if not thousands, of years earlier than it did.
Well, I'm not entirely sure it didn't actually go that way. I've not read the Origin contra Celsus, but I do think that that's something the pagans might actually bring up. So we'll have to see.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. Then lastly here, we're going to look at chapter 10. Yeah, because again, well, chapter 9, it's just a repeat of the gods doing, immoral, disgusting things. We don't really need to go over that again. Chapter 10, how we serve God. Okay, we serve God by good works of temperance, justice, and philanthropy. That might actually be charity. So that would be 3 of the 7 virtues. Temperance and justice are classical virtues, and charity would be a spiritual virtue. Men show God they are worthy through their works. Man having reason is persuaded by Christ to faith. Once having the faith, he performs the good works he was ordained for in order to show he is worthy and chosen to enter God's kingdom. Peace, the noble goal of human laws, being unachievable by human laws because of the power and influence of demons, has been achieved by God's law. He has driven the demons out of the hearts of man so they live peaceably. This shows the charges laid against us as Christians are false and spurious. And this is interesting, right? This is also very interesting. Notice what Justin doesn't say. We serve God by, doing all of these rituals like that we see in the Orthodox and Catholic Church. This is all very simple, something that you would expect a Protestant to say. There's really no added elements. Okay, granted, Reformed Protestants are going to get all tied up in knots about good works. Okay, fine, but you still got like Baptists and Methodists and Anglicans and others who would run with that pretty easily. And again, I think what's interesting with Justin here is the simplicity of the Christian way of life, not having all of these, using simulacrum again, not having all these levels of simulation built on top of the simple teaching. And I think what we're going to see as we go, well, within the ancient Nicene period, we're going to see a lot of consistency. But if we actually get to the end of that, which is a very long slog right now, I wouldn't say slog, but a very long journey. When we get to the 4th century and beyond, we will see the levels of simulation being accrued on top. The other thing that's interesting is I recently did a casual stream. It was number 3 about in the sort of game theory of like hawk and dove, giving a case for the dove position, because many people are like, well, just realistic to be a hawk, being a dove is being a chump. And basically, this is sort of an expression of the Christian ideal that we see in James. Let's see here. Let me look this up about where wars come from. But where do wars and fightings come from? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? James 4:1. Now, those desires, but then also the supernatural demonic agents that are inflaming those desires and impelling people to act out. And so what Christianity says is, well, by teaching people to follow Christ and following his teachings, we remove the primary efficient cause. An efficient cause is the means by which wars are started and crime is committed. these demonic agents that overwhelm our reasoning faculties. And so you could also tie that into his remarks earlier about the gods being immoral. Those gods teach people to do criminal acts, whereas through the God of Christ, what we Christians teach is how to obey the laws and keep peace. So really, was it 7, 8, 9, and 10 are on this kind of building up to this point.
Yeah, one thing I found in 10 that was really, really interesting is when he says, and we have been taught that he in the beginning did of his goodness for man's sake create all things out of unformed matter.
Yeah, that bit. Yeah, I caught that too. That caught my attention. Yes.
I didn't think they'd be weighing in so off the cuff so soon on matters of like creation ex nihilo, creation ex materia, and some of like the real finer points. So I was kind of tickled to see that. I wonder if I'll get to see a lot more of that in the contemporary dialogue for this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm glad you remembered that, because when I remember reading it at the time, I thought that was really uh, interesting, and that of course would contradict later Christian doctrines of creation ex nihilo. Also, formless matter, isn't that kind of like implicitly Aristotelian as well?
It might be. It might be Aristotelian. It might even be Platonist, right? So in some readings of the Phaedo, you get the idea that physical reality is fundamentally flux. It's fundamentally chaos. It's always like change for change's sake. And it's only after you induce like form on the matter that you have like directed change. You have change that actually makes sense. You can actually see the same things manifesting over time and so forth. And so reality is like the composition in Plato, if you read in one way, of form and flux, where you have form giving things their rigid shape and you have flux, causation, move, change, growth, and so on. It's like the both of those things combined that make the world what it is.
Right. So yeah, I think what we can say is that with these first 10 chapters, I would say roughly chapter 1 to 6 would be a sort of like legal defense. It's like, look, we know you're the pious, we know you have philosopher sons, we know that you know the protocols of justice, but we're just gonna spell it out all over again. So that's like the first 6. And then like 7 to 10, where we ended tonight, is yeah, the pagan gods are really sus, really bad, and it's almost like you have the gall to accuse us of immorality. Look at your own gods. And whereas 10 is the capstone. Look at what our God teaches us to do. Look at what we do for the peace and well-being of the empire.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
No, I think this one started out kind of slow. I think he said the same thing in so many ways in the first several chapters. But I think now he's going to kind of get into it. And if he's already dropping nuggets about like, creation ex materia versus creation ex nihilo, he's talking about idols, he's talking about all this other stuff. I think we're going to get into like the juicy bits of Christianity that like you're really interested in for historic reasons, and hopefully some of the more interesting topics as we move into the apologies that I'm interested in. So,
All right. Well, thanks again, Logos. And this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.